is we met her during the pandemic because she took us on a fantastic virtual tour to the Frick collection. She is currently finishing her PhD at Harvard University, has had very impressive fellowships, including at the Villa Tatti, and is now an education curator at the Frick collection.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you for this invitation to speak, and I'm so looking forward to hearing everyone's presentations. Let me just begin to show my screen here. Okay. All right, I'd like to begin just by introducing the Frick collection for those who may be less familiar with this museum. It is the Frick collection in New York City is sometimes referred to as a house museum, as it's located in what was once the private residence of the Pittsburgh coal and steel magnate Henry Clay Frick. So this Beaux-Arts mansion was built by Thomas Hastings of the firm Carrere and Hastings in 1913-1914. It's located at the corner of 5th Avenue and 70th Street. Frick, whom you see here on the left, lived here for just 5 years with his wife Adelaide and his daughter Helen, whom you see on the right. He lived here from 1914 to 1919. However, his widow lived on until 1931. So its life as a private home lasted 17 years. The Frick's now been a museum for the last 85 years, having opened to the public in 1935 in accordance with Frick's will. And here I'm sharing you some of the founding language from that will. I've bolded the passages that articulate the museum's public mission, the goal to create a public gallery of art for the use and benefit of all persons whomsoever. Frick said that he wanted this museum to be his monument, and he bequeathed both the house and his extraordinary collection of European paintings, sculpture, and decorative art to create it. It houses celebrated works by artists such as Rembrandt, Bellini, Ingres, Velázquez, Fragonard. And here I'm showing you the room that houses Fragonard's Progress of Love paintings. And on this slide, with a comparison between a historic photograph from 1927 and the year 2007, you can see that in general, little is changed from its appearance in the house, save for a few stanchions here and some new acquisitions. The museum has continued to add to the collection since Frick's death. So despite this tipping of the scales, despite the fact that the Frick has now been a museum for much longer than it was ever a private home, this refined domestic atmosphere of the late Gilded Age is maintained in the galleries. This is the grand staircase that connects the first and the second stories. Throughout the museum's history, only the first floor has ever been open to the public, but we are currently embarked on a renovation project that will see the second floor becoming open to visitors and open for the display of works of art as well. So here in the living hall, you can see that characteristic mixture of paintings, sculpture, pieces of decorative art, household furniture, all gathered in an immersive aesthetic ensemble with an absolute minimum of interpretive intervention. You'll notice the absence of wall text, of labels, as well as sound dampening carpets and light shading drapes. This is, I think, about as far from the maximally neutral white cube gallery aesthetic as one can get. And it's also certainly distinct from the echoey marble halls of many national or municipal art museums. Internal records show that striking this balance was a priority from the beginning, right as the mansion was being transformed into the museum in the years 1931 to 1935. The first director, Frederick Mortimer Clapp, sought to facilitate the public's access to art without utterly museumizing the building, stripping it down and reducing the atmosphere of an elite home. And that term, museumizing, is actually drawn from one of Clapp's 1935 memos. Of course, the Frick is not unique in this. There are other museums like the Wallace Collection in London, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, and the Musée Commandot that you mentioned earlier, Mimi, that have similar institutional histories and also present works of art in elite domestic settings. And I think that museum educators who teach in these environments face fascinating challenges. Namely, in a place where so many histories come together, art histories and American histories, Atlantic histories, the history of the Gilded Age, individual object histories that stretch from 1300 to 1900, and the very history of Western European art and the formation of that canon. How do you do justice to it? And moreover, how do you teach inclusively in a space that so clearly conveys exclusivity? So with what remains of my time, I'd like to speak to some of the work that we have done in the education department to address this. So educators at the Frick practice an object-centered, close-looking pedagogy that involves taking long looks at single works of art, beginning with quiet observation, followed by open conversation, facilitated by a gallery teacher who contributes information drawn from their own study of the object. An hour-long visit would usually include no more than 3 objects so that students can delve deeply into their own curiosity. Something that we noticed while teaching in this way was that students' attention sometimes turned, understandably, to the object's setting, which reads as distinctive and historic and opulent. So a close look at works by Rembrandt and Vermeer might also prompt observations about the room they were in, about perhaps its original function, speculations, questions about who lived in this house, how much it cost, where that money came from, and why Frick bought what he did. We, of course, wanted to honor students' curiosity and speak clearly about our origins while maintaining this object-centered pedagogy. So we sought ultimately to deepen our understanding of our institutional history and revise our approach to introducing the Frick in order to better honor those interests. We learned that many of the Frick's gallery teachers were hesitant to share much of our founding story with students, worrying that information about Henry Clay Frick's great wealth, the history of his labor opposition, might overshadow experiences with works of art. And perhaps more to the point, many of us who were teaching in the galleries were trained as art historians, and therefore we knew more about Medici Florence or Tudor England than we did about late 19th century Pittsburgh or turn of the century New York. So we built up primary and secondary sources on the Gilded Age, the development of big business, and here you see some period illustrations, signs for the H.C. Frick Coke Company. Frick's fortune came from Western Pennsylvania's rich coal deposits. He was involved in the production of coke, which is a coal derivative that was used as the fuel for the steel industry. And you see some of the dangerous and dirty conditions in which many of these workers were active. Pittsburgh at the time was described by one observer as hell with the lid blown off. And I think we kind of arrive at some of that here with this image. We also particularly sought to deepen our understanding of the Homestead Strike, which was an episode in Frick's life for which he was notorious in 1892. In seeking to open up a plant where workers were striking for better wages and better working conditions. Frick sent in a private militia, the Pinkerton Security Guards, who floated down the river on the barge to open up the plant. You see that here on the bottom right. And violence broke out, 9 or 10 men died, and this was national news. So for many people in Frick's own day, this is an episode that was closely associated with the Frick name, something that I think can be easy to forget in a space like this that tends to erase thoughts of violence and danger. So we were seeking to represent this history as accurately as we did that of Henry Clay Frick's collecting. And so we began to apply our close-looking pedagogy to the space itself, not only to individual works of art. We invited students to respond first to their surroundings. And we found that gathering these first impressions was very fruitful. Observations about the home's elegance presented opportunities to share information about the source of Frick's wealth and to note how exceptional a home like this was in a time of great income inequality. It also inspired students to comment on the taste on display, which some identified as Eurocentric. And indeed, Frick's taste was very culturally bounded to the Western European tradition. Students visiting the Frick have suggested that his collecting might represent a desire to participate in traditions associated with hereditary European aristocracies, and perhaps even attempts to rehabilitate his public image. Others have noted that the private wealth that is so clearly displayed at the Frick underpins the foundation of other museums and public institutions as well. And so in this way, an exploration of institutional history in the space of a house museum is prompting students to engage critically, not just with their immediate surroundings, but also with museums more broadly. Another element that this project raised for us was it prompted some critical thinking within the education department of the histories that we were focused on telling, certainly the histories of objects in the collection, but also kind of attending to the framing of the Frick story and the story of the museum. You know, in thinking about Frick's involvement in industry, we realized that perhaps we were thinking too narrowly about the workers in Pittsburgh. In fact, our very site, this mansion, this 3-story mansion with 3 people living full-time, was serviced by a staff of about 30. And those were stories that were largely unknown at the Frick collection. And so we became aware that our histories, the histories we were telling, at least of the mansion, were really dominated by architects, not builders, by owners, not workers. And in many ways, that makes sense, given that there are very few traces in any of these galleries of the work that went into running the home. And I'm showing you here just a few traces that exist behind the sofas in the West Gallery, which I was just showing you. These are call buttons, mother of pearl, that connected Henry Clay Frick, his guests, his family, to this staff of 30. And we're talking about hundreds of people who worked, who lived and worked on site over the course of those 17 years in which the Frick mansion served as a private home. And so this has now prompted within the education department research into the histories of those people who were working for the Fricks. And you see, we're relying here on the Frick family papers within the archives of our institution that record payroll, correspondence, expenses, things like that, that tell more of a story of the running of the home. And this is, I think, well-trodden ground within historic houses, but because the Frick was so deliberately and self-consciously, very intentionally created as an art museum, rather than as a temple to the life of Henry Clay Frick or the way his family lived in this home, this is material that's new to us, that's new for our understanding of this place. Some of you may know that the Frick, in pursuing this expansion project, has closed its doors at 1 East 70th Street at our home site and moved temporarily to the Marcel Breuer designed building at 945 Madison Avenue. And I'm showing you our incarnation as Frick Madison now. We are opening to the public tomorrow. And I hope that when you are able to visit New York, that you might see the Frick in this starkly new setting. And I also just wanted to note that much of what I've presented here is drawn from an article published this past summer with my co-author, Rachel Himes, a former colleague in my department. So I'd encourage you to look there. I'd be happy to share that reference with Mimi and the rest of the participants if folks would like to learn more. Thank you.
Fantastic, Caitlin. Thank you so much. And yes, please do share the reference. I'm sure lots of people will be interested in this. Very insightful. Of course, I'm really interested in seeing now what will happen in the new context with a new building and how people respond to this. I've read lots of enthusiastic responses, on social media and so on. So I'm curious to follow up.